Hey guys, tonight we begin with something that sounds almost like a parody, but unfortunately, it's not. Imagine being told that opening a book, the same stack of bound paper you probably have on your bedside table right now, could literally ruin your life. I'm not talking about destroying your social life because you spent too many hours inside reading. No, this was more dramatic. For a good century or two, a sizable number of doctors, clergymen, and well-meaning, but absolutely clueless intellectuals were convinced that women risked hysteria, infertility, and even full-blown madness simply by reading novels. That's right, fiction. A Quiet Evening with Jane Austen, or rather, with her early imitators before she even existed, was, in the eyes of 18th century medicine, basically the fast track to becoming a raving lunatic. And of course, people believed this because, well, why not double down on controlling women with yet another arbitrary rule? So, tonight, we're going to drift back into the long, candlelit evenings of the 1700s and 1800s, and we'll explore how a harmless paperback, or I guess a leather-bound, gilt-edged folio in this case, turned into a symbol of dangerous temptation. We'll meet the doctors who wrote long, boring treatises about it. We'll meet the women who secretly ignored them, and we'll see how society somehow made sitting quietly with a book sound more scandalous than running off with a highwayman. Now, before we really get into the weeds of this, just settle in, dim the lights, pour yourself some chamomile tea if that's your thing, and if you doze off halfway through the story, don't worry, I'll still be here, quietly rambling about how some 19th century man in a powdered wig thought novels would fry women's reproductive systems. Let's begin by setting the stage. It's the 18th century. Coffee houses are buzzing with political debate, newspapers are spreading like wildfire, and literacy is slowly becoming more common, not universal, but enough that people start to notice. And, predictably, whenever literacy spreads, someone always panics about what it might do to women, because clearly, women's fragile minds couldn't possibly handle too much information. Doctors in the late 1700s had an entire laundry list of things that supposedly triggered hysteria in women. Too much education, too much excitement, even too much fresh air on the wrong day could apparently do it. And when novels began to boom as a literary form, they quickly made the list of suspicious pastimes. Why novels specifically? Well, novels were different from history or theology. They were emotional. They were dramatic. They were fictional. And worst of all, they were entertaining. And in a society where women's entire moral worth was tied to their ability to be quiet, obedient, and not visibly enjoying themselves, something that provided escapism was naturally branded as dangerous. So doctors began publishing pamphlets and medical reports, claiming that women who read novels would overheat their imaginations. The idea was that a woman's brain wasn't built to distinguish between fantasy and reality. Too much exposure to made-up love stories, or daring adventures, or gothic castles filled with melodramatic ghosts would cause her to lose her grip on the real world. One physician even wrote that novels worked on the female body, much like alcohol did. They were intoxicating, addictive, and ultimately destructive. You could practically hear the panic in his tone, like he'd walked in on his daughter giggling over a book and thought, yes, hysteria begins at home. But let's float over for a moment to the cultural backdrop. The late 1700s were also the age of the Gothic novel. Think the mysteries of Udolpho, with fainting heroines, dark castles, stormy weather, and endless amounts of emotional drama. Young women loved these books. They passed them around, they read them by candlelight, and they sometimes even pretended to faint like the heroines did, mostly for fun. But of course society saw this as proof that books were rotting their brains. In one particularly telling anecdote, an English clergyman wrote that girls who read novels developed wild expectations about romance. Instead of happily marrying the dull, 40-year-old neighbor chosen by their parents, they might start dreaming about handsome strangers with soulful eyes, and that was obviously unacceptable. So the solution was simple: declare novels a health hazard. Much like today we slap warning labels on cigarette packs. In the 18th century, moralists slapped warnings on Robinson Crusoe and Pamela. Now, before we laugh too hard, it's worth noting that a lot of this was wrapped up in genuine medical ignorance. The science of the human brain was basically non-existent. Doctors still believed women's reproductive systems were directly linked to their mental health. So, if a young woman was acting odd, the diagnosis was usually that her uterus was misbehaving, wandering around her body, releasing strange vapors, or otherwise sabotaging her brain. Yes, that was a real medical theory, the wandering womb. And when you believe in something like that, it's not a huge leap to assume that a dramatic Gothic novel might somehow send the uterus into a frenzy. But of course, underlying all this pseudoscience was something much simpler: fear of women thinking for themselves. If a woman could read and imagine, she could also dream. And if she could dream, she might start questioning her reality. And you couldn't have that. Not when the entire system of inheritance, marriage, and polite society depended on women quietly doing what they were told. One of my favorite little contradictions here is that men could read whatever they wanted. In fact, they were encouraged to. A man who read novels was cultivated. A woman who read novels was unstable. Same books, different verdicts. Because of course, the male imagination was considered strong and rational, while the female imagination was leaky, delicate, and prone to hysteria at the drop of a hat. This double standard was so ingrained that even women sometimes believed it. You'll find journals from 18th century girls writing things like, "I must avoid novels, for they will surely weaken my mind." They literally internalized the idea that books were a kind of mental poison designed for their sex alone. Yet, and here's the quiet part, they still read them anyway. Because of course they did. Imagine being told you can't touch something, it just makes you want it more. So, many girls kept hidden stacks of books, borrowing them from friends, or sneaking them from circulating libraries. Some even wrote about reading entire novels in secret at night, while their families thought they were asleep. It's almost sweet, in a rebellious sort of way, like a 1790s version of reading under the covers with a flashlight. Let's pause and drift on that image for a second. Candlelit bedrooms, the faint scratch of quills, and young women quietly turning the pages of books that were supposedly ruining their health. It's ironic, really, because while doctors fretted about hysteria, these novels were actually teaching women literacy, empathy, and imagination. But history loves its ironies. And the irony here is that in trying to ban novels, doctors and moralists made them more alluring. Gothic fiction thrived precisely because it was seen as scandalous, much like modern horror films or band music. The fact that it was frowned upon made it more exciting. By the early 1800s, this fear had only grown stronger, especially as novels like Pride and Prejudice started sneaking real wit and social critique into their stories. Imagine the horror. Women reading and then laughing knowingly at the absurdities of their own society. No wonder doctors thought their wombs might explode. And with that, we'll ease our way toward some of the more specific cases. Because yes, there are individual women queens, duchesses, middle-class daughters whose lives were shaped by these anxieties around reading. Some were locked away from books entirely. Others defiantly read and even wrote their own novels, which of course caused their doctors to have minor heart attacks. But we'll save those stories for the next stretch of this journey. For now, just let the thought linger. Entire generations of women being told that their greatest danger in life was not disease, or childbirth, or political upheaval, but simply the novel. And of course, they didn't stop reading. Because honestly, would you? So, We left off with the idea that women quietly defied medical warnings and kept reading anyway. Tonight, let's float over into the real lives of some of those women. Because, as you can imagine, when society says don't read novels, or you'll go mad, someone is absolutely going to do, eat, and probably get accused of being mad anyway. Let's start in late 18th century England, where reading was becoming a social activity. Libraries were popping up in towns, not the public kind we know today, but circulating subscription libraries, basically Netflix for books, except instead of scrolling, you had to walk into a musty shop and pay a fee to borrow The Sorrows of Young Werther. And who were the biggest customers? Middle-class women. This alarmed moralists. They pictured young ladies huddled around a novel instead of doing embroidery, and it felt like a small apocalypse. One doctor, whose name I promise is real, wrote a pamphlet in 1797 titled The Evils of Novels. His argument was beautifully circular. Novels made women idle. Idleness made them nervous. Nervousness made them hysterical. And hysteria proved that novels were dangerous. See? Perfect logic. The kind you come up with after your fourth glass of sherry. But women still read. And occasionally, when one of them had a breakdown, which, to be fair, happened a lot in an age of poor diet, high child mortality, and arsenic in the wallpaper was blamed on books. Not the arsenic, not the grief, not the fact that childbirth was basically a lottery with a 1 in 8 chance of death. No. Clearly the problem was that she read too much poetry. One of the juiciest examples comes from the world of the Gothic craze. Anne Radcliffe, queen of spooky novels, became a household name. She wrote The Mysteries of Udolpho, which was basically the Marvel blockbuster of 1794. But with more fainting and candlelight, women devoured it. Men worried, and soon stories circulated of young ladies losing their grip on reality after reading too much. Radcliffe, one tale told of a girl who supposedly locked herself in her room after finishing Udolpho, convinced she too was imprisoned in a haunted castle. Another rumor claimed a woman went feverish and had to be confined to bed after binging Gothic novels for several nights in a row. Were these stories true? Probably not, but they served their purpose: little morality. Tales whispered to remind readers that books were as dangerous as brandy. Now, here's where the irony sets in again. While women were being told that novels caused hysteria, men were writing entire novels about women going hysterical. Take Samuel Richardson's Clarissa book So Long, It Makes War and Peace look like a pamphlet. The whole thing is basically one extended melodrama of a woman crying, fainting, and being preyed upon by predatory men. Critics loved it, and women read it anyway, weeping into their lace handkerchiefs. The medical establishment saw this and said, "Ah yes, this is proof. Women are far too sensitive for this material." Never mind that the novels were written to wring every last tear out of them like emotional sponges. It's like handing someone a bucket of onions and then diagnosing them with tearfulness syndrome. Let's float now across the channel, because the French were just as dramatic about all this. In Paris, novel-reading women were accused of having reading fever. Doctors actually wrote about it as if it were an illness. Symptoms included flushed cheeks, bright eyes, sleeplessness, and an unnatural sparkle of wit. Yes, wit was considered a medical symptom. Imagine going to the doctor and being told you're too clever. It must be the novels. One French physician even compared novel reading to stimulating the womb with dangerous fantasies. Again, the wandering uterus theory strikes. The poor organ was apparently unable to handle plots, characters, or suspense. Meanwhile, in Germany, The Sorrows of Young Werther sparked an even darker moral panic. Young men were said to imitate the suicidal hero, dressing like him, and even supposedly shooting themselves in fits of romantic despair. Women, of course, were accused of something worse, imitating his lovesick heroine and collapsing into endless sighs. So, while men were accused of Werther fever, Women were simply accused of weakness. As always, same behavior, different judgment. But the real fun comes when we move into the 19th century, because this is where medical science really leans in. By the Victorian era, doctors started diagnosing something called nymphomania. They wrote long, deeply boring journal articles about how young women, instead of caring for their families, were wasting away in bedrooms, pale and distracted, lost in their books. One Victorian doctor described a girl who spent nearly the whole day stretched upon a sofa, devouring volume after volume. He seemed horrified. I, personally, think she sounded like she had it figured out. These case studies always follow the same script. A daughter neglects her duties, reads too much, stops eating properly, and eventually faints or develops the vapors. Parents panic. The doctor is called, and the culprit is blamed. Not tuberculosis, not anemia, not depression, but novels. Always novels. We could pause here to notice something: the sheer paranoia about leisure. Women weren't supposed to have leisure. Their job was to work endlessly in the household, or look decorative if they were wealthy. Reading for fun disrupted that system. It gave them an inner life, a private world, and that was unacceptable. So doctors medicalized it. It wasn't that women were claiming space for themselves, it was that books were diseasing them. A neat trick, really? Blame the paper, not the patriarchy. One of the strangest twists is how this fear shaped actual education. Girls' schools in the 18th and 19th centuries often banned novels entirely. Approved reading lists were full of moral tales, religious texts, and carefully planned histories. Jane Austen joked about this in Northanger Abbey, where her heroine Catherine loves Gothic novels but keeps being told they'll rot her brain. Austen was poking fun at the idea, but the underlying truth was very real. Entire generations of girls were shamed into thinking that enjoying a book could literally make them sick. And if that wasn't enough, some educators recommended exercise as a cure for reading sickness. Too much sitting with a book was believed to sap physical strength, so girls were ordered to walk briskly in the fresh air, as if to flush the novels out of their system. Picture it, a procession of teenagers trudging around the garden, trying to sweat off last night's chapter of Udolpho. Let's drift back for a moment and take in the picture we have so far. The candlelit bedroom, the hidden stack of books, the doctors wringing their hands over fainting women, the moralists warning that fiction would rot the mind. And through it all, women just kept turning the pages. Because in the end, the novels weren't just entertainment. They were windows into different lives, different worlds, sometimes different possibilities for themselves. And maybe that was the real danger. So far, we've floated through the general atmosphere: the pamphlets, the doctors, the rumors of fainting girls and wandering wombs. But let's zoom in now, because this wasn't just a problem for anonymous middle-class daughters or the occasional Gothic fangirl. Even royals and aristocrats got tangled in the debate. Because here's the thing: if a duchess is caught reading too much, it becomes a scandal. And if a queen is caught reading, it becomes a political crisis. Let's start with Queen Charlotte, wife of George III. You may know her as the mother of a truly ridiculous number of children, 15, to be exact, or the woman whose court was stiffly moral at a time when society was anything but. Charlotte was supposed to embody the perfect model of female virtue: quiet, pious, devoted to her husband, and busy producing heirs like clockwork. But Charlotte also liked to read. Nothing scandalous by our standards. She read moral treatises, religious texts, and yes, occasionally a novel. This horrified some courtiers, because if the Queen of England, the ultimate role model, could sit with a novel, then what was to stop every bored young lady in the kingdom from doing the same? One critic sniped that Charlotte was too fond of books for her own good, and that it encouraged her daughters to become dreamers rather than doers. Imagine that: the horror of a princess daydreaming instead of embroidering handkerchiefs. And yet, despite all the pearl clutching, the royal family's women devoured novels. George III himself worried about his daughters reading frivolous romances. He kept their education tightly restricted, fearing they'd develop too much imagination. Of course, the irony here is that while he was worried about their novels, he himself was succumbing to episodes of mental instability. But heaven forbid anyone suggests the king had read too many Gothic thrillers. Now, let's drift a little further down the aristocratic ladder. Take Lady Caroline Lamb, one of the most notorious women of early 19th century England. She's mostly remembered for her scandalous affair with Lord Byron, the bad boy poet of the age, famous for his brooding good looks and even broodier poems. Lady Caroline was obsessed with novels, poetry, and especially romantic fiction. She devoured them. She even wrote her own. Her most infamous work was Glenarvan, a thinly disguised novel about her affair with Byron, published after he dumped her. In it, she painted him as a dark vampiric seducer, because subtlety was not her strong point. Predictably, critics accused her of hysteria. Doctors said her literary obsessions had unbalanced her mind. She was labeled mad, overheated by imagination, and eventually institutionalized for a time. The gossip was relentless. Lady Caroline had read and written herself into insanity. But if you look closely, the real story isn't about novels at all. It's about a woman stepping outside the boundaries of polite behavior and getting punished for it. Novels were just the excuse. Let's float across the channel again, this time to France, because no discussion of women reading too much would be complete without Marie Antoinette. Now, Marie was famously accused of all sorts of things: gambling, spending, adultery, even plotting treason. But tucked among those charges was another, quieter scandal: her supposed obsession with light novels and plays. Critics said she wasted her time with frivolous romances, instead of studying serious politics. Pamphlets accused her of corrupting the ladies of her court with endless gossip and sentimental dramas. Even her little make-believe village at Versailles, the Hameau de la Reine, was mocked as the product of too much fantasy reading. The irony is that while Marie Antoinette was blamed for escapist reading, the men running France at the time were reading equally escapist political philosophy, which arguably had a far more dramatic outcome. But again, women's reading was framed as idle fantasy. Men's reading was framed as the foundation of revolution. And then there were the literary women themselves, the ones who not only read novels, but dared to write them. Women like Anne Radcliffe, Frances Burney, and later Mary Shelley. Anne Radcliffe in particular was fascinating. She became one of the most famous novelists in Europe, and yet almost nothing is known about her personal life. She published wildly successful Gothic stories, then suddenly stopped writing, withdrew from public life, and lived in seclusion until her death. Almost immediately, rumors spread that she had gone insane from her own imagination. Newspapers whispered that she had been confined in an asylum. There was no real evidence, but the rumor stuck, because it fit the narrative. A woman who wrote too many novels must have succumbed to hysteria herself. It was the perfect cautionary tale. Don't read too much, or you'll end up like Radcliffe, quietly mad. Of course, later scholars discovered she'd lived a perfectly quiet, sane life with her husband, dying peacefully in 1823. But facts are boring. The myth was more fun. Let's pause here, because there's something deliciously ironic in how these women's private reading habits became public controversies. Think about it: an aristocrat reading by candlelight, a duchess scribbling notes in the margin, a princess sneaking a Gothic novel under her pillow. None of it should matter. And yet, entire pamphlets, gossip columns, and medical treatises were devoted to the problem. It's almost comical how much energy society poured into controlling women's imaginations. If they'd put half as much effort into improving medicine, maybe childbirth wouldn't have been so deadly. But no better to chase novels around the drawing room like they were wild animals. Now, Here's a slightly darker layer. In many cases, accusations of novel-induced hysteria were used as excuses to confine women. A husband or father who wanted to control his daughter or wife could point to her reading habits as proof she was mentally unfit. Cases survive of women being locked in asylums for melancholy brought on by excessive reading. Some of these asylums were little more than prisons. Once inside, it was nearly impossible to get out, and while their male counterparts might be locked away for alcoholism or violence, women's sins were often as mild as turning too many pages. It makes you wonder how many bright, imaginative women vanished from history simply because their families decided their reading habits made them unstable. As we drift toward the close of this section, let's hold that picture in mind. The queen, with her dangerous bookshelf. The aristocrat, whose romantic scribbling landed her in an asylum. The novelist rumored to have gone mad from her own imagination. Each of these women became part of the cultural story that books, especially novels, were too much for the female brain. And yet, of course, they kept reading. Because if history teaches us anything, it's that telling people don't is the fastest way to guarantee they will. So, we've seen queens sneaking novels, duchesses writing scandalous books, and doctors wringing their hands over fainting readers. But the Victorian age, oh, that's where things really take on a life of their own. Victorian doctors loved nothing more than giving new names to old anxieties, and once they had a shiny new medical vocabulary, they could turn any social problem into a condition. Too outspoken, hysteria. Too sad, melancholia. Too tired, neurasthenia. And if you are a woman who read too much, congratulations. You might have novel-mania. Yes, that was a real diagnosis. Entire articles appeared in medical journals in the mid-1800s, warning that novels weren't just silly or frivolous, they were pathologically dangerous. The argument went like this: women's brains were delicate. Novels overstimulated the imagination, and the result was nervous collapse. The solution? Ban novels, prescribe fresh air, and maybe some cold baths for good measure. Because nothing says cure like dunking someone in icy water for reading. Pride and Prejudice. Let's pause here and picture the setting. Middle-class families, sitting in their heavily curtained Victorian parlors, the father reading a newspaper, the son tackling his Latin homework, and the daughter, heaven forbid, curled up with a 3-volume romance. Enter the doctor, shaking his head gravely. Ah, yes, I see the problem. She's read chapter 23. That explains the pale complexion and listlessness. Clearly, the novel must go. Meanwhile, the son can chain-smoke cigars and drink gin at university without raising so much as an eyebrow. The double standard was baked into the diagnosis. Novel mania was not something men got. It was exclusively a women's disease. Men could consume Dickens, Dumas, or even scandalous French fiction without medical comment. But women, one too many volumes of Jane Eyre, and suddenly you were a nervous invalid. The symptoms, according to Victorian physicians, were delightfully vague. Restlessness, dreaminess, inattention to duties, a tendency to sigh without cause. If you're thinking this sounds like every teenager ever, you'd be right, which made the diagnosis extremely useful. Basic. Any daughter who didn't conform could be accused of suffering from novel-mania. One doctor even wrote that young women developed a peculiar pallor from too much reading, which he dubbed library complexion. As if the real culprit wasn't the gaslight, the smog, and the fact that most people in Victorian England were mildly malnourished. But sure, blame the books. Another physician warned that novels were injurious to the female reproductive organs, because of course the uterus had to be dragged into it again. According to this theory, emotional stimulation from novels sent shocks down the nervous system straight to the womb, leaving it exhausted and infertile. Imagine explaining to your gynecologist today that you've been reading too much. Tolstoy and asking if it's safe for your ovaries. The hysteria wasn't just medical, it was educational too. Girls' schools in the Victorian era sometimes banned novels outright. Teachers encouraged serious reading, history, moral essays, religious texts, but novels were treated like contraband. One headmistress even warned parents in a letter that novels weakened the moral fiber of girls, producing idlers and daydreamers rather than useful wives. Useful wives being, of course, the ultimate goal of education. Forget ambitions. Forget individuality. The whole point was to create women who could pour tea, smile politely, and endure childbirth without complaint. So, novels had to go. Because novels might make you dream bigger than the parlor walls. Of course. The irony is that this paranoia only fueled more demand. Circulating libraries thrived, and girls found ways to sneak novels into dormitories and bedrooms. School mistresses confiscated them constantly, and every time they were confiscated, the books became more alluring. Imagine a teenage girl in 1850 sneaking a copy of Jane Eyre under her pillow like it was contraband gin. That's how dangerous novels seemed. Intoxicating, forbidden, irresistible, and in some cases, these hidden books genuinely did shape lives. They gave women models of independence, wit, or even rebellion, which is probably why the guardians of morality were so determined to stop them. Let's float over to a few case studies that doctors and educators loved to trot out. One concerned a young woman described only as Miss A. According to the report, she spent long hours upon the sofa, absorbed in novels. As a result, she grew thin, pale, and nervous. The cure: her father burned her books and forced her to walk in the garden daily. The doctor proudly reported that her appetite returned and her health was restored. Another case described a schoolgirl who secretly devoured novels after lights out. When she became exhausted and irritable, the headmistress diagnosed novel poisoning. The cure was, predictably, banning books and assigning more embroidery, because clearly, nothing revives the human spirit like 10 hours of needlework. The language used to describe these cases is almost funny in hindsight. Doctors called novels opium for the mind, a fever of the fancy, and a destructive habit worse than gambling. Yes, worse than gambling. Imagine telling Charles Dickens that his serialized stories were more dangerous than betting the farm on a horse race. But in a way, these exaggerations show us something important. Novels mattered. They had power. They made women imagine, and dreaming was threatening. It disrupted the tidy structure where men ruled the world and women quietly supported it. So, to keep things tidy, doctors medicalized imagination itself. And here's where the story edges into darker territory again. Because once something is labeled a medical condition, it can justify confinement. Families could and did commit daughters or wives to asylums for novel mania. We have surviving asylum records listing reading as part of the cause for admission. Think about that. Women locked away in bleak, cold institutions, perhaps for the rest of their lives, for the crime of reading too much. Of course, once inside, they lost access to books entirely, which was probably the point. The diagnosis of novel mania gave patriarchal authority a shiny medical veneer. Fathers and husbands didn't just look controlling anymore, they looked responsible. They weren't punishing women, they were protecting them from imaginary disease. Now, to be fair, there were critics of this nonsense even at the time. Some physicians rolled their eyes at the hysteria over hysteria. A few even argued that novels could be beneficial, exercising the mind much like a walk exercises the body. But those voices were quieter, drowned out by the louder chorus of doctors who found it convenient to turn books into pathology. And so, throughout the 19th century, women kept hearing the same message: read too much, and you'll faint, lose your fertility, or end up in an asylum. But of course, they kept reading anyway, because at the end of the day, If the choice is between endless embroidery and sneaking a candlelit chapter of Wuthering Heights, who wouldn't risk a little novel mania? By the late 1800s, hysteria had become the fashionable diagnosis of the age. If you were a physician in Europe or America and wanted to make a name for yourself, you didn't study broken bones or lung infections. No, you studied women's nerves, nervous collapses, fainting spells, unexplained paralysis, convulsions. Everything was bundled into hysteria, and right there, tangled into the diagnosis, were novels, the psychiatric turn-in, like the earlier moral panic stage. Psychiatry didn't just wag its finger at novels for being frivolous. Now doctors were digging into how novels supposedly reshaped the mind at asylums like the Salpêtrière in Paris. Famous doctors such as John Martin Charcot studied hysterical women under the gaze of eager students. Many of these women were accused of reading too much fiction or, more damningly, of believing in the fantasies novels conjured. Doctors wrote that novels blurred the line between reality and imagination, leaving women prone to hallucinations or morbid daydreaming. This is where the word fantasy itself began to take on medical overtones. Daydreams weren't innocent anymore. They were symptoms. Freud enters the stage, then came Freud, and if anyone could turn novels into a diagnostic tool, it was him. Freud was obsessed with stories. He compared dreams to literature, called the unconscious a kind of narrative, and often described patients in terms of tragic heroines. But when it came to women, his verdict was familiar. Novels stirred dangerous fantasies, according to Freud. Women who read and daydreamed too much weren't simply indulging themselves. They were exposing their unconscious desires. A girl who lost herself in a romance novel was, to Freud, revealing her suppressed sexual longings or her unresolved father complex. Reading became evidence, a clue to hidden neuroses. And so, novels weren't just bad for nerves. Anymore, they were windows into pathological desire. Daydreaming as disease around this time. Doctors across Europe coined terms like excessive reverie, morbid imagination, and pathological daydreaming. Young women who escaped into fantasy worlds, whether through novels or simply by staring into space, accused of weakening their grip on reality. Doctors warned that excessive daydreaming could lead to hysteria, madness, or infertility. Case studies poured in. One doctor described a teenage girl who read novels late into the night, then began daydreaming about heroic lovers. She grew so absorbed in her fantasies that she ignored household duties. The cure: her books were confiscated, and she was put on a regime of cold baths, farm labor, and supervised social visits. Another physician complained that girls used novels as fuel for their daydreams, creating whole imaginary worlds where they were princesses, adventurers, or tragic heroines. This was seen as a direct rebellion against the roles society expected. And what happens when a woman refuses reality? The asylum door swings open. The asylum records by the turn of the century. Asylum intake records often listed reading habits as part of a patient's history. Sometimes it was paired with masturbation, another catch-all, moral panic. Sometimes it was lumped in with idleness or melancholia. The message was clear. Imagination itself could be evidence of instability. One chilling example: a girl in England, committed at just 16, with excessive reading and withdrawal into stories noted on her admission sheet. She remained institutionalized for decades. For men, excessive reading might earn you a reputation as eccentric. For women, it could get you confined. Novels as dangerous gateways. Doctors also worried that novels weren't just fueling harmless fantasies, they were gateways to worse vices. Reading a romance might encourage masturbation, yes, the Victorians were obsessed with this, or tempt women toward real-world affairs. One doctor warned that novels gave women false ideals of love, which left them unsatisfied in marriage. Another went further. claiming that novels disordered the womb by overstimulating desire, leading to infertility. Again, the uterus was dragged into the debate. By now, the fear of novels had become less about fainting spells and more about control. If novels encouraged women to imagine lives beyond the domestic sphere, that was intolerable. So psychiatry gave old anxieties a scientific gloss, the ironic twist. And here's the irony: many of these doctors were avid readers themselves. Freud devoured Goethe, Shakespeare, and Dostoevsky. Charcot used literature to dramatize his lectures. The men at the top of the psychiatric profession had no problem with novels when they read them. The problem was when women read them, because when women read, they didn't just consume stories. They identified with heroines, questioned their own lives, and sometimes made choices that unsettled the social order. The diagnosis of hysteria, the theories of Freud, the asylum records, all of them served as ways to discipline women who used novels as a tool for selfhood. Toward the 20th century, by the early 1900s, the panic began to shift. Mass literacy and cheap paperbacks made it impossible to police novels the way Victorians had tried. And slowly, the idea of novel reading as inherently dangerous faded. But the suspicion lingered. Even in the 1920s, critics worried about trash novels corrupting women and young people. Even today, echoes survive in the way certain genres, romance novels, even young adult fiction, get dismissed as unserious or silly, while male-coded genres, thrillers, are treated with more respect. It's the same old story. When women imagine too much, society gets nervous. So by the time we close the chapter on Freud and his colleagues, the pattern is clear. Medieval churchmen said novels weakened women's virtue. 18th century moralists said novels distracted women from duty. Victorian doctors said novels caused novelmania and hysteria. Freud and psychiatrists said novels exposed dangerous fantasies in every era. The message was the same: women should not think beyond their assigned roles. And novels dangerous, intoxicating, liberating. Novels were one of the easiest ways to slip those chains, which is why they had to be put. So here we are, sliding into the 1900s. Trains are faster. Telegrams are buzzing. Freud is still analyzing dreams like they're tragic operas, and women, while they're still reading a lot, and society is still a little twitchy about it. But the tone is changing. Instead of novels, we'll give you uterine cancer. The anxiety turns into something softer, but still dismissive. Now, women who read too much aren't sick. They're silly. The paperback explosion, cheap printing, was the real villain. Villain, if you were a pearl-clutching moralist. By the early 20th century, the dime novel and later the mass-market paperback were everywhere. Trains, waiting rooms, kitchens. Suddenly, reading wasn't just for the educated elite. It was for anyone with a spare coin and a few minutes. And what were the most popular genres? Romance, sentimental stories, family dramas, the very stuff doctors had been warning against for decades. So you can imagine the response. Critics declared that these books were trashy, escapist, dangerous to morals. Sound familiar? It's basically the 18th century sermon in paperback form, from pathology to mockery. The medical language of hysteria started fading. Doctors weren't really institutionalizing women just for reading anymore. But culture didn't exactly become enlightened. It just switched tactics. Now, the narrative was that women readers were shallow. They wasted their brains on melodramas. They were dreamers, unserious, distracted from real life. Instead of being locked in asylums, women were locked into a stereotype: the silly romance reader, a girl who sighed over novels instead of learning useful things, a bored housewife wasting afternoons on love stories instead of cleaning. It was a cultural downgrade, less terrifying, but still controlling. The rise of the fangirl. Fast forward to the mid-20th century. and the old suspicion of novels had morphed into suspicion of pop culture obsession. Teenage girls screaming over Frank Sinatra, Elvis, the Beatles. Suddenly they weren't fainting because of wandering wombs. They were fainting over pop stars, and the language used to describe them, practically identical to how people once described novel mania: emotional, overheated, lacking self-control, dangerous to their health. Doctors in the 1960s even published studies on the psychological risks of Beatlemania, which is hilarious, given that fainting at a concert is pretty much the same nervous collapse doctors once blamed on novels. So, really, the fear just switched costumes, from books, to music, to movies. The target was the same: young women daring to lose themselves in imagination. The modern echo. Even now, you can hear the ghost of these anxieties. When people mock romance novels, they often say things like they give women unrealistic expectations. That's the exact same argument 18th century preachers made when critics dismiss fan fiction as weird or delusional. They're repeating Freud's worries about pathological daydreaming. And when women who love Twilight, or 50 Shades, or K-pop are portrayed as obsessive, hysterical, or embarrassing, that's just the 19th century asylum, updated with hats, TAGS. The lesson is depressingly consistent. If women find joy in stories outside the control of institutions, whether novels, or bands, or fictional universes, someone will find a way to pathologize it. The enduring fear of imagination. At the heart of it all is this: imagination can be liberating. Reading lets you picture yourself as someone else, someone more powerful, more loved, more free. And for women stuck in restrictive roles, that act of imagining was dangerous enough to spark centuries of control tactics. From sermons to medical papers, from Freud's case notes to BuzzFeed listicles mocking romance readers, the thread is unbroken. Imagination is suspect when it belongs to women. So as we leave the Victorian asylum behind and step into the paperback age, the tone may be lighter, the punishments less brutal, but the suspicion remains. Women reading too much, still suspicious. Women daydreaming too much, still mocked. Women screaming too loud at a story, a singer, or a screen, still hysterical. The diagnosis has changed. The judgment hasn't. If history teaches us anything, it's that people love writing about other people's supposed bad habits. And when it came to women and novels, doctors, priests, and cultural critics kept a running log. What survives in their journals and reports reads almost like character sketches, except with a heavy dose of judgment. Let's flip through a few of these quiet, sad, and sometimes unintentionally funny portraits. The girl who read herself seek. One of the most common cases recorded in 18th and 19th century medical journals is the story of the teenage girl who fell ill from overreading. Doctors would describe her like this: she stayed up late with novels by candlelight, became pale, weak, and restless, and eventually collapsed with nervous exhaustion. The treatment: her family confiscated the books, forced her to rest, and usually sent her outdoors for fresh air and farm labor. Some journals describe girls being ordered to milk cows or scrub floors to ground them back in reality. The logic being, if daydreams made you sick, physical drudgery would cure you. Of course, there's a simpler explanation. The girl was probably just tired. Or maybe she was depressed. Or maybe she was a normal teenager, trying to escape a suffocating household through stories. But instead of empathy, she got a diagnosis. The housewife with novel mania, a more dramatic type of case, involved married women. In one French medical report from the 1830s, a doctor described a woman in her 30s who spent every free moment with novels. She apparently ignored housework, snapped at her children, and grew distant from her husband. The doctor concluded that her habit of novel reading had disordered her judgment and morals. What was the cure? He recommended she be placed on a strict domestic schedule, with novels banned, prayers increased, and meals regulated. In other words, punish her until she returned to being the obedient wife everyone expected. The subtext is clear. Her crime wasn't being ill. It was refusing to put her husband and house before her own interests. And books made that rebellion possible. The young woman in the asylum, perhaps the saddest. Records are from asylums. Admission logs in Britain and America sometimes list reading novels under causes of insanity. In one case, a girl of 16 was committed for withdrawal into stories and refusal of house duties. She wasn't violent. She wasn't dangerous. She just wanted to stay in her books. She ended up institutionalized for decades. Her novels, her fantasies, her very imagination were treated as symptoms of madness. You can picture her, a quiet girl, clutching a worn book, shut away behind barred windows, while doctors used her as an example of morbid reverie, the dangerous reader on the other extreme. Some accounts painted women readers as temptresses. Doctors and critics argued that novels didn't just make women sick or dreamy, they made them seductive and immoral. One English pamphlet described a maidservant who read romantic novels, then attempted to act them out by flirting with her employer. The text is full of warnings that novels encouraged unwomanly boldness and disobedience of rank. Of course, whether the maid actually did anything wrong is impossible to know. More likely, she was just accused of stepping out of line, and novels were a convenient scapegoat. The pattern across stories. What ties all these cases together isn't the details, but the framing. If a girl was sick, novels were blamed. If a wife was unhappy, novels were blamed. If a servant disobeyed, novels were blamed. If a patient daydreamed, novels were blamed. The pattern is too neat to ignore. Novels were less a medical danger and more a social threat. They gave women alternatives, possibilities, and a private space that no husband, father, or doctor could fully control. And that was threatening enough to pathologise. Reading between the lines. When you read these old reports today, you can almost hear the anxiety trembling beneath the surface. The doctors aren't just describing symptoms, they're describing fear. Fear of women imagining more than they were supposed to. Fear of women who dared to be bored with housework. Fear of women who wanted adventure and freedom, even if only on the page. And so, page after page, history preserved these little portraits of bad readers. Girls who read themselves pale. Wives who read themselves defiant. Patients who read themselves insane. What they really were, though, were early reminders that reading is powerful. Stories aren't passive. They can unsettle lives, especially the lives of those told not to want more. By now, you've probably noticed a pattern. Whenever women enjoyed a type of story, someone in authority decided it was dangerous. But this wasn't just about isolated cases of girls fainting over novels. Whole categories of books were condemned, as if they were contagious diseases. So, let's float through a few of the genres that critics loved to hate, and why they thought they spelled doom for women. Gothic novels, haunted castles, hysterical readers are the Gothic novel. If you were a young woman in the late 18th or early 19th century, chances are you encountered these gloomy tales full of ruined castles, dark corridors, fainting heroines, and brooding villains. Think Anne Radcliffe, Matthew Lewis, and their endless parade of ghostly monks and mysterious staircases. For women readers, the Gothic was irresistible. You got danger, suspense, mystery, all from the safety of your bedroom, but critics loathed it. Doctors warned that the Gothic overstimulated women's nerves. Clergymen claimed it corrupted morals with too much supernatural nonsense. Moralists said it filled women's heads with unrealistic fears. And yet, sales boomed. Gothic novels weren't just popular, they were devoured. Jane Austen even poked fun at the craze in Northanger Abbey, where her heroine is accused of letting Gothic novels warp her imagination. In other words, Gothic fiction had already earned the reputation of being the gateway drug of female hysteria. Sentimental novels, too many tears, too few duties. Another major target was the sentimental novel. These were stories full of weeping heroines, tragic deaths, letters drenched in emotion, and long scenes of fainting or moral struggle. They were written to make readers cry, and women ate them up. Critics argued that these books softened women's minds. If you spent hours sobbing over fictional misfortunes, how could you possibly handle real life? Worse, sentimental novels were accused of making women self, teaching them to relish their own grief instead of getting over it. One critic even claimed that sentimental novels encouraged women to practice sorrow, like rehearsing fainting fits for attention, which sounds less like medicine and more like pure projection. Romance serials, addiction by the page, by the Victorian period. Cheap printing made serialized romances widely available. These were the soap operas of the 19th century, published in weekly or monthly parts, designed to keep readers hooked with cliffhangers. And, of course, women were accused of becoming addicted. Critics compared serialized novels to gambling, alcohol, even drugs. Doctors complained that women couldn't stop reading them, ignoring meals, or staying up late at night. One commentator wrote that romance serials ravished the mind and left women unable to focus on reality. Sound familiar? It's basically the same language people use today about binge-watching Netflix. Domestic novels, too comfortable to be harmless even. Novels about ordinary home life, what we'd call domestic fiction, weren't safe from suspicion. Stories about families, marriages, and household struggles might sound tame, but critics claimed they gave women dangerous new perspectives. If you saw fictional wives questioning authority, or fictional daughters dreaming of more than marriage, you might start asking the same questions yourself. So even these cozy stories were scolded for stirring discontent. The irony, of course, is that domestic novels often reinforced traditional roles. But even the faintest whiff of rebellion was enough to set off alarms. The disease metaphor over and over. Critics reached for the same metaphor. Novels as disease. Gothic novels were an infection of the imagination. Sentimental novels were a contagion of the nerves. Romance serials were an epidemic of addiction. Domestic novels were slow poisons of discontent. The language makes it clear. Novels weren't just bad entertainment. They were seen as a literal public health problem. Reading was treated like catching a fever. The irony of high literature, and here's the kicker, when men wrote big, heavy, serious novels like Dickens, Tolstoy, or Hugo, those books were praised as uplifting, educational, even morally improving. But when women consumed lighter, shorter, or more emotional novels, suddenly it was silly or dangerous. The double standard was glaring. It wasn't the act of reading that was condemned. It was the act of women reading what they liked. Why genres matter? Genres gave women choice. If you were trapped in a rigid social role, novels let you pick a different script. Gothic novels let you be the heroine in a haunted castle. Sentimental novels let you feel emotions that weren't safe to express in real life. Romance serials let you escape into a thrilling new world every week, and that freedom of choice, choosing what to feel, what to imagine, what to enjoy, was the real threat. So, as much as doctors and critics tried to demonize specific genres, the attacks always circled back to the same fear. Women with too much imagination, too much freedom, too much independence of thought. It didn't matter whether the story was about ghosts, heartbreaks, or housewives. What mattered was that women were reading, and society didn't quite know how to handle that. If there's one constant in history, it's that the loudest voices warning against pleasure are often the ones sneaking a taste when nobody's looking. And when it came to novels, the cast of critics was as colorful as any fictional villain. Let's meet a few of them. The clergy, morals on paper. First up, the priests and ministers, from the 18th century into the 19th. Clergy were among the loudest novel-haters. Their sermons thundered against trashy romances, as if they were sinful temptations. Novels, they warned, distracted women from piety, encouraged lustful thoughts, and filled their minds with false ideals. Some even claimed that novels were a gateway sin. First, you read about forbidden love in a book. Next, you went looking for it in real life. Pretty soon society was overrun with fallen women. Of course, this was often coming from men who spent long hours in candlelit studies, reading, sometimes even writing religious allegories that were basically just novels with Bible quotes stapled on. But, totally different. The doctors, scientific finger-wagging fun came. The physicians, as medicine professionalized in the 18th and 19th centuries. Doctors loved attaching themselves to cultural debates, and novels were a juicy target. Doctors diagnosed novel mania with the seriousness of tuberculosis. They warned that reading too much weakened eyesight, strained the brain, and because every ailment in this period somehow circled back to it disordered the uterus. The hypocrisy. Many of these same doctors were closet biblical. Sigmund Freud, for example, devoured Goethe and Shakespeare while lecturing patients on how novels inflamed women's fantasies. Other physicians were publishing their warnings in printed books. So, novels were corrupting women, but their own books. Pure intellectual medicine, of course. The moralists, critics with pens and other. Loud faction were the cultural critics, essayists, and pamphleteers, who made their reputations by sounding very worried about things. They wrote long, hand-wringing essays about how novels corrupted youth, destroyed marriages, and spread idleness. They insisted that serious literature was good provided it was written by men. Of course, but women's favorite genres were dismissed as trash. You get the sense they weren't actually concerned about health. They were concerned about taste. To them, women reading melodramas was the equivalent of someone today admitting they binged reality TV. How gauche. But instead of just rolling their eyes, they pathologized it. And thus, their essays made it into the moral canon. The politicians and reformers even. Some politicians got in on the act. In certain reform movements, novels were treated like a threat to national stability. Why? Because novels filled people with dangerous ideas, romantic notions of equality, or sympathy for the poor, or, heaven forbid, thoughts that women might deserve better lives. If you could discredit novels as hysteria-inducing nonsense, you could avoid having to confront their more radical messages. It was an elegant little trick. Censor the imagination, and you never have to reform reality. The personal irony's the most amusing part of all. This is how often the critics contradicted themselves. A priest would thunder about immoral books, then pen a sentimental religious romance himself. A doctor would warn about reading too much, then publish a 1,000-page medical treatise. A moralist would call novels a waste of time, then secretly borrow his daughter's copy of The Mysteries of Udolpho. The critics weren't really afraid of novels. They were afraid of losing control of the narrative. As long as women got their ideas about life from priests, doctors, or husbands, everything was fine. But if women started getting ideas from heroines in books, that was unacceptable. The voice of authority. What? All these critics shared was a need to sound authoritative. They positioned themselves as guardians of morality, of health, of society. Women, in their view, couldn't be trusted with imagination. Someone had to supervise. Someone had to warn them. Someone had to diagnose them. And so, century after century, critics churned out sermons, essays, and medical reports. They all sound eerily similar. Whether you're reading an 18th century sermon, a Victorian medical case, or a 20th century editorial dismissing romance novels as junk. A sleepy observation, if you strip away the costumes, priestly robes, doctor's coats, powdered wigs, you end up with the same figure. A man, clutching his authority, worried that women might slip the leash of imagination. And his tool of choice wasn't chains or whips, but words, diagnoses, labels, mockery, the quiet violence of telling someone their joy is a sickness. So when we read the critics now, with their solemn warnings and confident judgments, it's hard not to smile a little. Not because their words weren't harmful, they absolutely were, but because their fear is so transparent. The louder they shouted about novels being dangerous, the more obvious it becomes. They knew stories had power, and they were scared of losing it. If you were a woman in, say, 1820, and you wanted to borrow a book, the experience might feel oddly like visiting a doctor's office. Someone your father, your husband, or perhaps a stern librarian would decide what was safe for you to read. Books weren't just stories. They were medicine, or poison, and entire genres were labeled accordingly. So, let's wander together, row by row. The safe shelf first stop, the approved section. These were books nobody worried about. Here you'd find religious devotionals, sermons, moral essays, and improving biographies. They were long, tedious, and designed to keep the mind properly humble. The ideal was that a woman would fall asleep before she managed to learn anything too stimulating. Cookbooks and etiquette manuals were also welcome. Nothing threatening there. If you were a young woman, you could spend hours memorizing recipes or practicing how to walk gracefully while balancing a teacup. Truly thrilling stuff. History books were acceptable too, but only the right kind. Dry accounts of kings, wars, and treaties, usually written in prose so thick it could double as a sleeping draught. The unspoken rule was simple. If the book reminded you of your duties, it was safe. The mildly suspicious shelf. Now, we float to the next row. Here the books get a little more questionable. Poetry often lived here. Some poetry was deemed noble and pure, like Milton, who was hard to understand, and therefore, apparently, safe. But other poets, like Byron, were filed under dangerous. Byron, with his scandalous affairs and brooding heroes, was thought to stir up passions. A girl who read too much Byron might find herself gazing dramatically at the horizon, sighing for a forbidden love. And we can't have that. Travelogues were also a mixed bag. Reading about faraway lands might fill a woman with dangerous curiosity. What if she decided she wanted to leave her small town? What if she wanted to see the world herself? Clearly safer to stick with descriptions of English gardens. The scandalous shelf. Now, we reach the forbidden corner. The novels. Here sat the books that sparked both delight and dread. Gothic romances with crumbling castles and fainting heroines. Sentimental novels where women fell in love, made mistakes, and sometimes gasped found happiness outside of traditional structures. These books were whispered about like contraband. Critics warned they could unbalance the mind. Husbands joked about burning them in the fireplace. Parents hid them in cupboards. And yet, these were the books women reached for. They stayed up late, reading by candlelight, heart pounding. Not from fear of the story, but from the thrill of doing something forbidden. The irony was, most of these novels were tamed by modern standards. Today they'd be considered cozy, even quaint. But in their time, they represented a world where women could imagine different outcomes. And that was enough to scandalize polite society. The secret shelf. And then, there were the books that didn't make it onto library shelves at all. The true contraband. Medical texts that described women's bodies in detail. Political tracts demanding reform. Pamphlets that dared to question authority. Sometimes women found these books through brothers, lovers, or secret lending societies. And when they did, the ideas inside could be quietly revolutionary. The fear wasn't really about fainting fits or nervous disorders. It was about what happened if women read too widely and too freely. They might start thinking, comparing, questioning. And once that door was open, it was very hard to close again. A sleepy reflection. So much of this shelf policing feels familiar. Today, we still hear echoes of it whenever someone dismisses romance novels as trash, or scoffs at a genre because it's popular with women. The words change, but the message lingers. Your enjoyment is suspect. Your taste is frivolous, and your stories are dangerous. It's the same library, just with a different cataloging system. Drifting to the exit as we leave our imaginary library, let's take one last look at those forbidden shelves. The books are still there, spines worn, pages smudged from eager hands. They survived the sermons, the doctors, the critics, the politicians. And now, centuries later, people still read them. Often, in bed, late at night, much like you're listening now. The critics faded into footnotes, but the novels, they became classics. For all the hand-wringing and finger-wagging, women never really stopped reading novels. In fact, the more society told them not to, the more enticing those pages became. It was like being told not to press a red button. Suddenly, everyone wanted to know what would happen if they did. So tonight, let's drift gently through some stories of actual women, famous and obscure, who kept turning those forbidden pages. The giggling schoolgirls in boarding schools across Europe. Girls smuggled novels into dormitories. Officially, they were supposed to read improving literature, prayers, grammar lessons, maybe the odd bit of history. But tucked under mattresses or hidden in sewing baskets were contraband. Volumes of Gothic romance. One French headmistress in the early 1800s complained bitterly that her students whispered about the mysteries of Ut late into the night. They acted out scenes, swooned dramatically, and horror of horrors, ignored their embroidery practice. The cure: confiscating books, which of course made them more desirable. Some girls copied whole chapters by hand to keep the stories alive, a labor of love and of quiet rebellion. The aristocratic addicts among wealthy women. Novels were sometimes read with a wink and a shrug. Take Lady Caroline Lamb, for example, Byron's infamous lover. She devoured novels and poems, often reading them aloud at parties. Her critics painted her as a hysterical woman undone by fiction, but really, she was just enjoying stories that mirrored her own chaotic life. Many noble women kept cabinets of novels, sometimes disguised with dull-looking covers so that nosy relatives thought they were reading sermons. Imagine a gilt-edged book labeled Prayers of St. Augustine. That turned out to be a tale of haunted castles and midnight escapes. A quiet little joke against propriety. The middle-class readers for middle-class women. Novels became both an escape and a point of pride. Circulating libraries made books affordable. For a small subscription, women could borrow the latest sensation and swap it out every few days. It became a social ritual. Ladies met at libraries, compared notes, and shared recommendations. Of course, critics sniffed that these women were wasting time gossiping about novels instead of, say, darning socks. But really, the library was one of the few public spaces where women could participate in cultural life. Talking about books was a way of talking about themselves, without breaking social rules too loudly. The working class dreamers, even working women, when they could, snuck time for reading. Factory girls pooled wages to buy cheap reprints. Servants read discarded volumes passed down from their employers. Sometimes they had only fragments, half a book, a few chapters ripped from a magazine, but they still cherished them. There are letters from maids in 19th century England who described crying over fictional heroines, or laughing at absurd melodramas. Their employers called this nonsense. For them, it was a rare slice of leisure and imagination in lives otherwise consumed by labor. Women of letters. And then there were the women who went further, not just reading novels, but writing about them. Jane Austen's novels were playful conversations with the genre itself. She had clearly read and chuckled over those dramatic Gothic romances. Her heroines read novels too, and sometimes got in trouble for it. It was her sly way of defending the practice, while still poking fun at its excesses. Other women kept journals full of reading notes. They critiqued characters, copied favorite passages, even dreamed aloud about what kind of heroines they would be. These journals often remained private, but they reveal a quiet world of female intellectual life. The critic's nightmare, what all these women had in common, was simple. They didn't wait for permission. The clergy preached, the doctors diagnosed, the moralists warned. And yet, women kept reading. In bedrooms, in carriages, in kitchens, in libraries. With giggles, with tears, with sighs. The critics imagined passive, fragile readers, ruined by every page. The reality was messy and human. Women were thoughtful. They laughed at bad writing. They rolled their eyes at ridiculous plots. They sometimes fell for the fantasy, sometimes didn't. In other words, they were readers just like anyone else. A sleepy, closing thought. If you close your eyes, you can almost hear them. Pages turning in the dark. Candles burning low. A soft giggle as a schoolgirl reads about a ghost. A sigh from a housewife finishing a romance. A servant tracing her finger over the words before blowing out the lamp. The critics tried to silence them, but the sound of quiet reading kept echoing, and in a way, it still does. Every time someone curls up in bed with a book that isn't serious enough, they're part of the same long tradition. Here we are, at the quiet end of our story. We've wandered through centuries of fear, finger-wagging, and fainting couches. We've watched doctors pronounce novels a medical hazard. Priests call them sinful distractions, and cultural critics dismiss them as silly fluff. We've seen schoolgirls whisper in dormitories, aristocrats smuggle books under religious covers, and maids cry over half-ripped chapters. And yet, through all of it, women kept reading. The critics thundered, but the pages turned anyway. The absurdities left behind, it's almost funny. Looking back, how serious the warnings sounded. That novels would disorder the womb. That poetry would melt the brain. That a few hundred pages of gothic melodrama could ruin a marriage or topple an empire. We can see now that the fears weren't really about health, or morality, or eyesight. They were about power. Novels gave women a space where they could imagine differently, love differently, live differently, even think differently. And that, more than any diagnosis, was what unsettled those in charge. The absurdity is clearer with distance. The novels survived. The warnings faded into footnotes. The stories that critics tried to suppress became classics, while their names are mostly forgotten. The echoes that linger, and yet, even now, the echoes are still there. Romance novels are still dismissed as trash. Women's reading habits are still mocked as unserious, frivolous, or hysterical. The labels have changed, but the tone hasn't. The quiet implication that women's pleasures are suspect every time someone rolls their eyes at a genre because it's popular with women. They're playing a very old part in the same old play. It's the 18th century clergyman, the 19th century physician, the Victorian critic all whispering through the ages, "Careful, your joy might be dangerous." The readers who persist, but the story never really belonged to the critics. It belonged to the readers. Women who hid novels in sewing baskets. Girls who read by candlelight until the wax ran out. Friends who swapped volumes and giggled over scandalous plots. Writers like Austen, who gently poked fun while defending the act of reading itself. Their quiet persistence was the real rebellion. They didn't need manifestos or revolutions, just the patient, ordinary act of refusing to stop, turning one page after another. And in that persistence, something shifted. What was once forbidden became ordinary. What was once scandalous became literature. What was once dismissed became cherished. A sleepy farewell. So, as we close tonight, imagine the scene again. A darkened bedroom. A single candle flickering. A woman with a book in her lap, half smiling at the page, half listening for footsteps in the hall. That moment, intimate, fragile, rebellious in its own small ways, what survived. not the critics, not the just the simple act of reading. And maybe, as you drift into sleep tonight, you're part of the same tradition, listening to stories, letting words carry you somewhere else, ignoring the voices that say it's a waste of time, because in the end, stories are never the danger. Silence is.